Nobody warns you that the clearest act of love you'll ever witness might look, from the outside, like a catastrophe, and that the people who caused the catastrophe will be the last ones to understand what they actually set in motion. I was 26 when my grandmother Theodoline spent $30,000 to join what my father had been calling, for 11 months, the family trip of a lifetime. Portugal, Spain, the south of France, 22 days. He'd been planning it the way generals plan campaigns: color-coded spreadsheets, laminated itineraries, a WhatsApp group named Vargas Europe 2024 that had 214 unread messages by the time we got to the airport. Theodoline, Theo to anyone who loved her, which was mostly me, had mortgaged a plot of land in Minas Gerais to afford it. The land wasn't worth much, but it was hers, and it had been hers since before I was born. She sold it without telling anyone except me, and only told me because I drove her to the notary's office in Belo Horizonte on a Tuesday that smelled like eucalyptus and rain. "You don't have to do this," I said outside the building. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I'm doing it." She was 71. She'd never left Brazil. She'd never seen a sky that wasn't Brazilian, never eaten bread that wasn't padaria bread, never heard a stranger's language floating past her in a crowd. She wanted to walk where her mother's mother had walked, in a village in Portugal whose name she'd been carrying inside her chest since childhood, like a splinter she'd learned to breathe around. My father, Reginaldo, had not exactly invited her. She had inserted herself, gently, methodically, the way she did everything, by asking questions about the trip until it became understood that she was coming. Reginaldo was not the kind of man who could say no to his own mother's face. He was, however, the kind of man who could engineer a situation where no became unnecessary. What I know now, and didn't know then, is that he and my mother Serline had decided weeks earlier that Theo wasn't coming. Not because they disliked her, exactly, but because she made the trip more complicated and slower, and they'd already imagined it without her. They'd imagined it without her the way you imagine a room after you've already decorated it. There simply wasn't space for one more chair. So they did something I still struggle to describe without my voice changing register. They booked her a ticket. They let her sell the land. They let her buy a suitcase she couldn't afford. And on the morning of the flight, 4:47 a.m., GRU Airport, Terminal 3, the kind of hour that feels both impossible and inevitable, my father put his hand on her arm and said, with the face of a man delivering news that genuinely pained him, I forgot your ticket. You can't board. You'll have to go home." He hadn't forgotten anything. I was standing close enough to watch her face go through 4 different expressions before settling on the 5th, which was a stillness so complete it looked like patience, but was actually something else entirely. The stillness of a woman who had spent 71 years learning not to let the wrong people see her bleed. "The ticket?" she said. "I thought I'd printed it. I looked in the bag. It's not there." "Can't they look it up? With my name?" My father had prepared for this. He shook his head with what I can only describe as practiced confusion. My mother was examining the departure board like she'd just spotted something fascinating in Terminal 2. My cousins Walber and Prisciane had suddenly discovered urgent reasons to stare at their phones. My Aunt Geza was picking lint off her jacket. Nobody looked at Theo. Nobody except me. And what I saw on her face, in the half-second before she composed herself back into dignity, was something that cracked something in me that has never fully fused back together. It wasn't just hurt, it was recognition. The specific, quiet devastation of someone who realizes they've been arranged around, that the story they'd been living inside had a different plot than the one they'd been told. She understood, in that moment, that the ticket had never been forgotten. I understood it 2 seconds later. My father was already looking at his watch. "We can't miss boarding. Walber, grab your bag. We'll bring you back something. We'll call every day. You'll be fine." He kissed her on the cheek. He kissed her on the cheek. My mother hugged her, quickly, the kind of hug you give to punctuate an ending, and then they were moving toward security, the whole family, this shuffling formation of rolling suitcases and duty-free anticipation, and nobody turned around. I turned around. I had my passport in my hand and my boarding pass on my phone, and I hadn't slept. And I wanted to see Lisbon more than I'd wanted most things in the recent portion of my life. I had a picture in my mind. Alfama at dusk, Theo's hand in mine, her face when she finally stood in the village her grandmother had described to her when she was 6 years old. That picture didn't work without her. I picked up her suitcase. She was already looking toward the exit, composing herself for the taxi ride home, for the house that would be empty for 22 days while her family sent postcards she'd display on the refrigerator. "Theo," I said. She turned. "I'm not going." She started to argue. She used the voice she used when she was trying to protect you from herself. A gentle, insistent voice that said, "This is too much. Don't do this for me." I held up one hand. "Where do you want to eat breakfast?" She looked at me for a long time. "There's a padaria in Consolação," she said finally. "They make pão de queijo at 5 in the morning. Then that's where we're going." We took a taxi to the padaria in Consolação. We sat at a small table near the window while the city turned from black to gray to the pale yellow of early commerce. And we ate pão de queijo and drank café com leite, and Theo didn't cry, which I respected enormously. And I didn't either, which required more effort than I'll admit. She didn't say much about what had happened. She wasn't that kind of woman. She talked about the village in Portugal, Figueirinha, a place so small it didn't have a postcode, just a name and a handful of houses and a church that had been rebuilt after the 1755 earthquake. And she described it from memory, the way her grandmother had described it to her, which was the way her grandmother's grandmother had described it before that. A chain of women passing a village down through language because none of them could afford the fare. "Maybe someday," she said. "Maybe," I said. But I was thinking hard, and with the particular focus that comes from having had everything you expected stripped away in a 45-second conversation at 4:47 in the morning. Here is what I want to tell you about the next 3 weeks, because this is the part nobody expects, the part that doesn't fit the shape of the story you think you're reading. I did not spend those 3 weeks in Sao Paulo. Neither did Theo. 3 days after the airport, after I'd slept, after I'd called my father and said very calmly that I had stayed behind with Theo and that we'd talk when he returned, and after he'd said several things I won't repeat here, I sat down with Teodoline at the kitchen table in her apartment in Pinheiros with a legal pad and a pen. "Tell me everything you know about Figueirinha," I said. She told me. It took 2 hours. There were dates and the names of churches, and a river that ran past the village in a specific direction, and a stone wall her great-grandmother had described touching with her hands. There was a name, Osvaldo Quaresma Braga, who was her grandmother's youngest brother, who had stayed behind when the rest emigrated, who had presumably had children, who those children might have had children. I spent 3 days on the internet in a way I have never been on the internet before or since. I found genealogical records through the Portuguese National Archive. I found a parish register digitized by a university in Coimbra. I found, eventually, a forum post from 2019 written by a man named Benedito Quaresma, asking if anyone had information about the Quaresma family of Figueirinha, Alentejo. I sent him a message at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. He responded in 4 minutes. He was 78 years old. He was Osvaldo's grandson. He had lived in Figueirinha his entire life. He had been looking, intermittently, for the branch of the family that had gone to Brazil for 40 years. He wrote in formal Portuguese that carried the weight of someone who had composed this message many times in his head before sending it. "I had begun to believe you did not exist." I showed Theo the message on my phone. She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the table and pressed her hands flat against the surface and breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. "Book the flights," she said. We flew to Lisbon 9 days after the airport, not with the family, not on the family's itinerary or schedule or laminated plan, Just us, with 2 carry-ons and Tio's documents and a printout of Benedito's messages. We rented a small car in Lisbon. Theo had never been in a left-hand drive car in Europe, which is not the same as a left-hand drive car in Brazil, and she navigated from the passenger seat with the same focused composure she'd applied to everything else. And we drove southeast through landscape that looked, she said, almost exactly the way her grandmother had described it. Stone and scrub and a sky that was a slightly different blue than the Brazilian sky, a blue with more weight in it, more history, more sediment. Figueirinha was 94 houses, a church, and a square with an acacia tree that Benedito said was older than the oldest person anyone could remember. He was waiting for us in the square. He was a compact, brown-skinned man with white hair and my grandmother's eyes. I noticed that before I noticed anything else, before Theo noticed it herself, and when she did, she stopped walking. She stopped walking in the middle of the square in Figueirinha and stood there for a moment while a cat crossed between them and the church bell produced a single resonant note for no apparent reason. Then she walked to him. They stood together for a moment, speaking in a Portuguese that was different from mine. Older, more formal, the Portuguese of letters and parish registers. And then Benedito said something I couldn't hear, and Theo laughed. And it was the laugh of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, been told they can put it down. I'm not going to tell you what the house looked like. I'm not going to tell you what they found in the boxes Benedito had kept in a cedar chest since his grandmother died. Photographs, letters, a small lace collar that had belonged to a woman whose name Theo knew, had always known, had grown up hearing. I'm not going to tell you about the afternoon we spent in the church with the priest, a young man named Ezequias, who was clearly delighted by the entire situation, or the dinner that extended to midnight, or the way the village's other families materialized gradually as word spread, because some things belong to Theo, and I'm only the person who was there. What I will tell you is that we stayed for 11 days. We stayed 11 days in a village of 94 houses in southern Portugal, and I slept in a room that smelled like lavender and old stone, and Theo slept down the hall in a room where her grandmother's sister had once slept. And every morning, Benedito's wife, Alcinia, made coffee in a stovetop pot, and we sat in a small garden surrounded by rosemary. My family was in Barcelona by then. They sent photos to the WhatsApp group, the Sagrada Familia, La Boqueria, someone's paella. My father sent a voice message saying the trip was incredible and that he hoped Theo was doing okay. I did not respond to that one immediately. We flew home on a Friday. I had 17 missed calls from Reginaldo by the time we landed because I had posted 2 photographs from Figueirinha on my personal Instagram, one of the church, one of Theo and Benedito standing under the acacia tree, and he had evidently seen them and had evidently spent some time in the middle of the trip reckoning with what they meant. My parents returned from Europe on a Sunday afternoon. They came to Theo's apartment in Pinheiros, which is where I still was, where I'd been since we landed, because there were things Theo and I were still sorting through. Photographs, documents, a package Benedito had mailed us from Figueirinha that contained a letter and several items we hadn't had room to carry. My father opened the door and I was standing there. He went pale. That's not a figure of speech or a dramatic embellishment. Reginaldo Vargas, who is a large man with the coloring of someone who is almost never pale, went pale in the doorway of his mother's apartment. Because standing next to me, seated, actually, at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, with the weekend's papers spread around him, was Benedito Quaresma, who had, apparently, taken the matter of reconnected families seriously enough to book a flight to Sao Paulo, who was 78 years old and had never left Portugal before in his life, who had, in 11 days, become something I don't have a clean word for. Not a friend, not exactly family, though technically he was, but something that operates in the register of family without quite fitting the category you inherited by default. My father stood in the doorway for a long time. My mother, behind him, made a sound I couldn't interpret. Benedito looked up from the papers and said, in his careful Portuguese, You must be Reginaldo. Theodoline has told me many things about you. His tone was not unkind. It wasn't anything in particular. It was the tone of a man who was exactly where he meant to be, saying exactly what he meant to say, without any additional architecture. My father came inside. He sat down. He was very quiet for a long time, which is not something Reginaldo is, as a rule. I went into the kitchen to make more coffee, and Theo followed me, and we stood at the counter together while the coffee brewed, and she said, quietly, without looking at me, "You didn't have to stay." "I know," I said. "You gave up the trip." "I got a different one." She put her hand on my arm, briefly, and then removed it, which is the Theo equivalent of a lengthy declaration. We went back in with the coffee. Reginaldo was asking Benedito about Figueirinha. Benedito was telling him. My mother had found the photographs on the kitchen shelf. Theo had framed 2 of them, the church and the acacia tree, in the week since we'd returned, and she was holding one of them and her expression was doing something complicated. Nobody said anything about the ticket. Not that night, not that week. Eventually, months later, my father and I had a conversation that I won't reproduce here because it's ours and because it ended in a way I hadn't predicted. Not with absolution, which I wasn't prepared to give, but with something more durable than that. Something that required us both to be honest about things we'd rather have left in the category of unexamined. Benedito stayed for 10 days. He and Theo talked every afternoon. She drove him to Consolação for pão de queijo. He declared it deficient compared to bread he'd had in Alentejo, which made her laugh that same laugh from the square. When he left, he hugged her at the airport with the careful, deliberate firmness of someone practicing something they intend to do again. "Next time," he said, "you come back, and you bring more family, the ones worth bringing." He didn't look at me when he said it, which meant it was for Theo and not for me. But I was standing close enough to hear it, which, I've come to understand, is exactly where I was supposed to be. If this story reached something in you, hit like and subscribe. Every click keeps stories like this alive.